For almost 8 decades, Hitler's secret headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, had been hidden behind reinforced concrete and in thick forest growth. Historians had regarded it as just another fallen bunker into obscurity, but then researchers returned with state-of-the-art ground-penetrating radar technology in 2024, and their findings far exceeded what could be expected to be discovered. To their astonishment, they discovered Nazi detention cells in pristine condition dating back to the end of the Second World War. The contents were so remarkable that even seasoned experts were taken aback, and the Nazi regime had made a concerted effort to prevent anyone from ever seeing what was contained within. But the real question haunted everyone. What secrets had been buried so deep that even time itself tried to erase them? The fortress in the forest, Wolf's Lair background. During the summer of 1940, when Nazi Germany was preparing Operation Barbarossa to assault the Soviet Union, Hitler directed a clandestine military headquarters that would be invisible to airborne surveillance and remain intact in the case of destruction. What was created was far greater than simple military-style construction. Camouflaged beneath their depths of leaves, marshes, and camouflage netting, this fortress embodied the very essence of terror. This was Wolf's Lair, and it would be the synonym for terror and secrecy for generations to follow. During 1940 and 1941, Hitler's engineering unit and the TOD organization constructed this fortified complex. These same engineers had already overseen the forced labor camp programs constructing the Reich's highways, concentration camps, and underground bunkers within occupied Europe. Missourian Forest's location was obviously intended and wicked. The dense forest, in its impenetrable swamps and isolation, ensured that unwanted visitors would experience permanent disappearance. Airplanes could only view from above an apparently limitless sea of trees, concealing one of the war's most powerful command posts beneath the deceptions of confusing camouflage. The center evolved into a huge complex that held numerous structures like hardened bunkers, soldier barracks, electrical substations, guard stations, and even a train terminal of its own. Hitler insisted on sole independence, with the installation capable of being sustained, even if severed from external supply lines. Perimeter defense was stupendous, with 3 concentric rings of security, denoted as sparicides. The outer ring comprised lethal minefields and wire screens of razor wire that would shred any attempted penetrator. The middle area had vicious guard animals and well-armed men in high observation towers. At its center was Hitler's own bunker complex, complete with conference rooms and personal quarters for his inner circle. Now buried deep in Poland's Kipsing Woods lies the ruin of Adolf Hitler's secret advance command post, Wolf's Lair. Fewer military bases in history had more rigorous security controls. The bunkers themselves were massive in size, with steel-plated reinforced walls and thicknesses in meters. These vast structures were under layers of camouflage netting and moss cover. Windows were reduced to thin slits or altogether omitted. Conditions within were damp and airless, heavy with the stench of mold. Natural light found it difficult to penetrate the interior spaces, creating an atmosphere of perpetual fear that left a deep impression on all who saw it. Despite its formidable defense, this fortress was the headquarters from which Hitler directed the campaign to the east. For several hundred days, he directed operations behind its gates, commanding military campaigns that condemned millions to death. But even this stronghold of paranoia was not invulnerable to treachery. On July 20th, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg clandestinely brought an explosive device into one of the complex's conference huts. Having placed the bomb close to Hitler and quietly retreated, the ensuing blast annihilated 4 top-ranking officers and leveled the hut. Hitler survived only because of a near-miraculous intervention of a large wooden conference table that took most of the impact of the blast. Although severely burnt and deafened, he crawled out alive. This botched assassination exposed the truth that even within the most secure Nazi stronghold, plots could germinate. The repercussions were ruthlessly draconian, with paranoia reaching extreme proportions throughout the facility. Security precautions mounted, metal doors were installed throughout the compound, and a perpetually stifling environment reigned. The hideout was now a purgatory of suspicion, where loyalty was forever put on trial and the specter of execution always hung heavy. When Soviet forces broke through in 1945, Wolf's Lair was vacated by German forces. In one final desperate attempt, they attempted to blow the complex up with explosives, but walls of unusual thickness allowed numerous sections to stand as ghostly blisters in the forest landscape. That initial brick and concrete structure begun in 1944 had expanded into a vast fortified complex encased in multiple layers of concrete walls. Following the war, the 54,000 landmines had to be cleared before the remains could be accessed safely, which reason it took so long for the interior to be fully explored. Recently, researchers searching for secret underground chambers at Wolf's Lair revealed prison-style complexes that shocked even seasoned researchers. Their find reminded everyone that this was always meant to be a place of secrets, death, and horror. Some of Hitler's inner circle lived inside the fortress of fear. None was as corrupt and brutal as Hermann Goering, whose private villa at Wolf's Lair would be the site of an appalling find. Historians now desperately try to search for leads in regard to his participation concerning the atrocities laid beneath his hidden chambers. Vanity, power, and atrocity. Hermann Goering embodied the typical Nazi arrogance, with a ruthlessness-free brutality and uncommon greed. His downfall was in April 1945, when he was an American prisoner after he suffered a sudden loss of authority. A legendary World War I flying ace, Goering was first a war hero icon admired by all Germans. This prestige later enabled him to transition into politics, where he acquired a position of indispensability. After joining Hitler in the early period of the Nazi movement, he established the Gestapo in Prussia in 1933, creating a mighty secret police organization that terrorized opposition groups systematically and crushed dissent. Nazis flocked to volunteer for membership in what they perceived as an elite corps, creating a regime founded on fear and intimidation. This single achievement made him a top-notch architect of Nazi brutality. His authority grew further after the construction of the Wolf's Lair. The complex served as a command post for tactics where Goering orchestrated his vision of horror in backroom meetings, protected by steel-reinforced walls and gunslingers. From 1935, Goering was commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, a post that brought him immense prestige and placed him in the heart of Hitler's war machine. Initially under his control, the Luftwaffe expanded at a phenomenal rate, appearing to validate Germany's growing military might. But his tenure in office was quickly marked by catastrophic failure and unbridled arrogance. In 1940, he promised Hitler that his air force would destroy Great Britain during the Battle of England, and he boasted that London could be bombed into submission within weeks. Instead, the campaign disintegrated in October that year, when Hitler was forced to give up his plans for an invasion because Britain continued its resistance. At the Wolf's Lair, Goering attempted to justify his losses as he pretended to be irreplaceable, even as frontline soldiers died as a result of his tactical mistakes. Late in 1942, with the Soviet siege of Stalingrad, Goering reaffirmed that his Luftwaffe could still maintain air resupply of the surrounded troops. He pledged to bring hundreds of tons of rations, gasoline, and ammunition daily. Reality was appallingly different, for the aircraft carried only percentages of what was required in service. Soldiers perished from starvation, cold, and drastic ammunition shortages. In February, the army was exhausted. Over 900 surviving forces were captured, the majority of whom would never return home. Such blunders had cost countless lives, yet Goering still clung to authority. Safe in the Wolf's Lair, he accepted briefings with self-satisfied aplomb, feigning ignorance of how his general promises had condemned an entire army to ruin. Goering also set out the 5-year plan designed to prepare Germany for unlimited war. According to this scheme, he controlled forced labor, plundered resources, and ordered ruthless asset extraction from conquered nations. His thievery and corruption rendered him one of the wealthiest men in the Reich. The Wolf's Lair provided Goering with another advantage to the extent that he could keep his policies under surveillance in security while indulging in luxuries that savagely conflicted with the misery endured by millions outside its confines. His profligacy reached a peak at Hall, an enormous palace constructed adjacent to Berlin. The compound had plundered art taken from museums and Jewish communities across Europe, its walls adorned with masterpieces by Raphael and Rembrandt. Bedrooms were packed with gold, invaluable jewels, and luxurious furniture. As he stayed in comfort at the Wolf's Lair, Goering was surrounded by extravagance, while others around him were constantly terrified and in discomfort. The complex was not only his workplace, but also another source of power, where he rendered judgments condemning millions, and alongside him were symbols of extravagance and splendor. The secret cells and tunnels in the compound made covert operations far from the reach of prying eyes. Much of his activities were perfected in these secret rooms. Justice eventually caught up with Goering after World War II. Convicted at Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against humanity, he was sentenced to be hanged to death. Having exercised the prerogative to sentence his victims to death or any punishment as he saw fit, he denied them so much as that measure of justice. Ultimately, he poisoned himself with cyanide and died in his cell in 1946. But if Goering believed he could carry his secrets to death about his hidden chambers, he was mistaken, for recently experts revealed them. But what could possibly be so disturbing beneath the walls of Goering's villa that historians hesitated to speak about it? Shocking discovery beneath Goering's villa. In 2024, archaeologists unearthed a rare discovery during routine excavation. The La Tabra Foundation and the Wolf's Lair unveiled human remains near Ming's old personal apartments. Instead of caves or rubble, researchers found bone remains in professional secret rooms that resembled prison cells rather than burial tombs. The dig uncovered 5 skeletons, 3 adults, 1 teenager, and 1 baby. The find became more and more disturbing based on the condition of the remains. Each skeleton had no hands and feet, apparent proof of intentional mutilation and not natural decay. Foundation member Dominique Markovich explained that the find was amazing, with the clean cutting as evidence of intentional disfigurement. The bodies had been buried under what appeared to be a 1940s maintenance room floor and were accompanied by era-appropriate plumbing fixtures. They had been intentionally concealed without attention to military burial procedures or victim memorialization protocol. The staging suggested continued captivity even in death. The absence of personal effects provided a striking contrast to the scene. Researchers took great care to preserve evidence, as the corpses had been stripped of identifying features before they were concealed. Archaeologists had also referred to the site as haunting and desolate. Polish prosecutors referred to the site as a probable crime scene on hearing the news. Investigators took methodical photographs of every corner, angle, and disturbance on the ground around the remains. As they investigated the evidence, experts conceded that they had more questions than answers. Prosecutors took over the site and initiated systematic excavation. Every artifact was thoroughly documented. Archaeologists took a photograph of the ground surface and employed grid mapping, boxing, and marking each bone for chain of custody. The goal was to preserve every contextual artifact for analysis. Initial examination according to the condition of bones and depth pointed to sources prior to 1945, possibly in the initial stages of World War II. This concluded the criminal investigation process. Forensic specialists prepared for the simulation of bone analysis, establishing isotope testing with strontium and oxygen sampling. These substances, ingested via diet and water, could identify the areas where the victims were raised. Researchers wanted to correlate isotopic signatures to geographic origin to determine if the victims were German, Eastern European, or from occupied territories. Carbon dating would also be crucial in determining mortality dates. While the initial estimates put the deaths during the 1920s or the 30s, these were not final until after closer examination. Physical anthropologists would search for markers of trauma on the skeletons, like broken ribs, skull fractures, or bound limbs. These could indicate execution, imprisonment, or ritual killing. If they were political prisoners, resistance fighters, or victims of medical experiments, their wounds could be consistent with documented Nazi interrogation and medical experiment protocols. Conclusive inferences would follow from completing a thorough osteological analysis. Worrying most was the possibility that these remains appeared in no documents that were known to the Nazis. If the victims could not be matched against such known documents, this would suggest an off-book operation unknown to authorities, or something concealed by Hitler's innermost allies. Analysts retraced steps to review old intelligence files and historical testimony, particularly Heinrich Himmler's events in the lower parts of the Führer bunker during his final months. But what if those hidden operations beneath the Führer bunker weren't just secret experiments, but the final phase of something darker? Heinrich Himmler and the shadow of the Valkyrie plot. Heinrich Himmler, no typical military commander, turned out to be a master administrator in the Nazi movement. His rise to power was based on 3 legs: fear, loyalty, and systematic elimination. By 1944, he had centralized command of the SS, Gestapo, and all police forces of the Third Reich, following the failed assassination of Hitler on June 20th, an event in history known as Operation Valkyrie. The failure of Hitler to be killed on July 20th, 1944, constituted another turning point, in that Himmler subsequently assumed total control of internal security. Rather than regarding the conspiracy as treason, he exploited it as a means to systematically rid the German army of anyone whose loyalty to Hitler was not absolute. Himmler arrived at the Wolf's Lair within hours of the bombing with carte blanche powers. What ensued bore little resemblance to an actual investigation. Instead, it became an excuse for a purge masquerading as justice. The purge extended well beyond suspected conspirators, ensnaring hundreds of Haran police officers, including war heroes and medal earners. In Berlin, victims were executed by public hanging, hoisted up with piano wire in specially designed chambers to elicit as much suffering as possible. Some others were dispatched into secret torture camps, intimidated into fabricated confessions, and then vanished for good. Official records were actually forged or destroyed. Entire families were targeted in a systematic attempt to instill fear in the populace. Hitler himself, from his personal chambers, viewed footage of some of the killings, purportedly insisting that even more officers be made examples. The Wolf's Lair itself turned into an interrogation and punishment center. Himmler dispatched SS troops to conduct meticulous searches of every nook and cranny of the complex. Secretaries were interrogated, drivers were taken into custody, and communications personnel were scrutinized for coded messages. Guards and engineers were questioned for sabotage. Paranoia hit an all-time high, with even loyal old comrades unwilling to utter a word out of turn or to be found near the wrong individual. Wavering allegiance was no longer acceptable. It had to be demonstrated daily through concrete actions. Recent history lent new significance to these early occurrences in the form of a judicial discovery among the remains of Göring's destroyed mansion. A number of human skeletons were uncovered by archaeologists within what appears to have been a deliberately destroyed subterranean chamber. Notably, the remains showed no evidence of ritualistic burial ceremonies, suggesting victims were discarded rather than interred. Forensic examination revealed bones fractured in the patterns of blunt trauma sustained either before or during death. What is more, no records have been discovered here of any official executions, nor has any known prisoner roster matched either the quantity or scope of remains discovered. This very absence of records itself is a hallmark of Himmler's purges, executions, punishments, or rituals. The recent excavation of skeletal remains at Cirkeltava has fueled speculation concerning dark possibilities. Even in the absence of hard evidence, researchers tend to shun sensationalism, but some facts are impossible to disregard and beg speculation that is as unsettling as it is unresolved. A prevailing theory is that these bodies were the result of covert executions ordered by Nazi officials in Oranienburg, carried out under the authority of persons like Hermann Göring or Heinrich Himmler, who had nearly unlimited power throughout East Prussia. Heinrich Himmler was one of the most influential men in Germany throughout World War II, presiding over both the enormous SS empire and German police forces, with the authority to decree death sentences without judicial process. It is not impossible that civilians or even lesser SS officers may have been shot and buried in unmarked graves in the forests. The final months of the war were characterized by internal paranoia and brutal repression. Following the fall of the Eastern Front, orders may have been issued to murder anyone who was deemed disloyal or troublesome, or who simply had unwanted knowledge. The condition of the skeletons offers particularly grisly testimony. Some bear signs of deliberate mutilation. One has no hands whatsoever, and another has no feet. Forensic experts initially considered the likelihood of animal involvement, not unheard of with exposed corpses. The joints appear to have been divided cleanly and do not reflect any haphazard gnawing or natural decay. This element suggests intentional human intervention. In the Nazi era, and more precisely under SS leadership, punishment routinely involved outright brutality. The cutting off of hands or feet was not only violence but a message calculated with intent. It is confirmed through history that accusations of theft could lead to amputations of the hand, which would act as public warnings to others. Treason or desertion could be penalized by pre-execution mutilation, particularly if directly ordered by high-ranking officers such as Himmler or Goering. If these amputated limbs were punishment-related, then it is likely that the victims were secretly executed and buried to conceal the crime. That these remains are near the Wolf's Lair, a location notorious for its atmosphere of paranoia, secrecy, and absolute control, lends credibility to this theory. The most unsettling theory possibly is one of occult ritual murders. Investigators discovered a small stone enclosure close to the burial site, which resembles Neolithic structures. Initially unidentified, they were later recognized as fossilized belemnites, which were locally known in folklore as thunderstones. The fossils, which had also been previously associated with German pagan mythology as either weapons tossed by the gods or as manifestations of divine anger being discovered in this foreboding burial environment, have called into question ritualistic undertones, particularly as Himmler's documented interest in the occult is well established. As Reichsfuhrer SS, Himmler was devoting significant resources to pseudo-scientific expeditions, astrological research, and an ambitious project to develop a new Aryan religion. Reincarnation and sacred bloodlines were part of his ideology. The isolated forest surroundings of headquarters would have been an ideal location for secret rituals, if such had occurred. No physical evidence of ritual activity has been found, however. No symbols, no markings, no written documents. Yet the absence of physical proof has done nothing to end continuing beliefs. Local residents have described strange lights and unusual events in these woods for years. Now, with the uncovering of these skeletons in the same earth, the distinction between historical fact and nightmare has grown increasingly blurred. Until the time when definitive evidence surfaces, these macabre theories can only contribute to the appalling gravity of the Wolf's Lair. The current Wolf's Lair. The Wolf's Lair is today a complex of 80 bunkers and buildings in a marshy forest beyond the Prussian eastern town of Rustenburg. The remains of Hitler's former fortified command headquarters are both a tourist attraction and the scene of serious archaeological investigation. Guided tours detailing Nazi operational procedures in the complex have been permitted for visitors to explore the bunkers since the early 1990s. Portions of the complex have been partially reconstructed or stabilized, whereas others remain in ruin. The installation of information panels, memorials, and even gift shops reflects increasing public interest, but also stirs controversy among those who feel that the commercialization of the Wolf's Lair may cause its historical significance to be diminished. They caution against dark tourism and question the appropriateness of opening a location so intimately associated with Nazi strategic planning to commercial visitation. Contrarily, advocates make the case for visits as learning experiences, particularly when combined with respectful historical context and sensitivity to victims of the regime. Meanwhile, the site remains an ongoing archaeological site. Recent excavations have unearthed chemically sealed armored doors and ventilation systems believed to be components of a chemical defense system. The total lack of windows indicates that ventilation and oxygen must have been solely dependent on a complex ventilation system and on hidden stairways that were not shown on the original plans. These findings suggest that the Wolf's Lair was much more complicated than has been understood. Other researchers have suggested that additional secret rooms may exist, perhaps buried under rubble or vegetation. The 2024 discovery has reopened interest and suspicion. People now ask themselves what else the site might be hiding. Polish authorities have authorized limited new research, though access remains highly restricted. For as long as this restriction holds, the Wolf's Lair will be one of the most unsettling and incomplete sites in history. Feel free to share your thoughts regarding this discovery in the comment section below. Don't forget to also like, share, and subscribe.